Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin shortly. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. Today, we will be discussing the importance of the Transatlantic Partnership. We are honored to be joined by two friends and partners of AJC, U.S. Congressman Brian Mast, who serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism, and Anna Michelle Asimakopoulou, a member of the European Parliament from Greece and Vice Chair of Transatlantic Friends of Israel. Our conversation will be moderated by Daniel Schwamenthal, Director of AJC's Transatlantic Institute. The concept for today's program was born out of AJC's Transatlantic Institute in Brussels, which in July 2019 launched Transatlantic Friends of Israel. Transatlantic Friends of Israel is a cross-party interparliamentary group dedicated to the post-war order of transatlantic security and cooperation. Through AJC's presence and perseverance in both Brussels and Washington, we are committed to bringing together parliamentarians on both sides of the Atlantic to tackle the most pressing issues of our time. If you missed part one of this series last week with U.S. Congressman Ted Deutsch and member of European Parliament Lucas Mandel, please visit ajc.org/advocacyanywhere to watch the recording. After we hear from our guests today, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, that is questions plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Daniel, you and our esteemed panelists have the floor.
Thank you, Danielle. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you today for our AJC Advocacy Anywhere program. Anna Michelle, ladies first, of course. Last July, the American Jewish Committee helped launch the Transatlantic Friends of Israel. You immediately agreed to serve as the group's vice chair of the European Parliament. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about your personal family history and your very personal connection to Israel and the Jewish people.
Sure. Thank you very much, Daniel. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you today, Congressman. How nice to see you. And it was an honor to join AJC. And of course, it was very natural for me. I represent the Hellenic Republic in the European Parliament. I'm Greek, and my father was Greek, but my mother was Jewish. And I say was because she actually had to convert to Christianity to marry my Greek father after they met at Brandeis University. So I've grown up bicultural, and I've always considered the Jewish part of my heritage a part of me that I'm very proud of. In fact, I actually got to champion this when I was a member of the Greek Parliament under Prime Minister Antonis Samaras, and I was his party spokesperson. And we actually did the anti-racism. One of the first laws I got to vote on was the Anti-Racism Act, which made Holocaust denial a crime in Greece. And later, I also got to champion our fight against Golden Dawn, which was our Nazi party, which was then rising and has now basically we're in the court fighting them on being illegal, and they've basically disappeared from party politics. So it was only natural for me, Daniel, when I came to Parliament and saw this excellent AJC initiative to want to continue this work in the transatlantic context. And I have to say that it's been a year now, I'm a new member of the European Parliament, just elected this term, that this is one of the most fulfilling and enriching experiences in the Parliament. I want to congratulate you publicly for the excellent work you're doing. And I know that all the colleagues, we're all working as a team to champion issues that have to do with Israel and the transatlantic relationship.
Thank you so much. I assume nobody will quite believe it, but this was not pre-discussed. Thank you very much for these kind words. We did travel last year together on an AJC Project Interchange seminar to Israel. What were your most memorable experiences from this trip?
You know, Daniel, I'd been to Israel a few times. So, you know, when you invited me, I was pleased to you know, go with a group and learn more. But I have to tell you that of all the things you do at AJC and these very interesting discussions I participated in, we've done stuff in Parliament together, brought experts. I've met people from the colleagues from the Knesset when I was in the United States. This was really something very special. I learned so much about Israel's innovation culture, like at the Simon Peres Center. But mostly what I saw with my own eyes was the incredible security risk that Israel is facing. Whether, I mean, going to at the Dado lookout point, it's one thing, you know, to hear about this, and it's another thing to just look across and see what's going on. It's another thing to hear things from a distance, and it was another thing for me completely to be at the Nahalaz kibbutz and to hear the community talk about the fact that they lost a 4-year-old child named Daniel from a rocket that you know, hit the kibbutz. So really, I would just encourage you to do as much of this as possible. I went during a time where the Knesset wasn't really operational, so that the politics of it were not so strong, but the experience was really unforgettable. Not to mention the helicopters. Not to mention, I haven't been in a helicopter. This probably for the congressman, this is a joke, but for me to be in a helicopter for 4 hours was a new experience. So.
Right. We are using helicopters not because Israel is so big, but quite the contrary, because it's so small. And the helicopter flight gives you a real impression how tiny the country is.
Really remarkable and truly, really, truly inspiring for my country as well. Not just for the relationship, but for my country, Greece, as well.
Thank you. Congressman Mast, first of all, I would like to acknowledge for our worldwide audience your distinguished military career, which earned you, among other medals, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart. And while deployed in Afghanistan, you worked as a bomb disposal expert under the Elite Joint Special Command, where you suffered severe injuries. So first of all, on behalf of AJC, I want to thank you for your service.
Thank you.
In addition to your 12 years in the US military, you also had a stint in the Israeli Defense Forces. So we would like to hear how this came about. What motivated you to do this? And what were your most vivid impressions from your time there?
No, it's a very important question. Let me just start out number one and say thanks for having me. I'm happy to join you all today. But what brought me to Israel is, I guess some of us can find it hard to answer. How do we get certain battles that get placed in front of us? But when a battle is placed in front of us, we have to make that choice. Are we going to go out there and fight that battle, or are we going to ignore it and walk away and pretend as though it was never placed in front of us? And this battle, the catalyst for me going over to Israel for the first time, really occurred when I was a student at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I was living very close to a big park in Boston called the Boston Commons. And at this time, this was in 2014, what was going on was Operation Protective Edge at this time that this catalyst occurred. And in Boston at that time, there was a lot of anti-Israel protests that were going on a nightly basis in this large park that I was living right next to. And as I'm watching on TV each and every night, the attacks that are going on in Israel and seeing everything going on there, and the politicization of it, and the attacks politically against Israel for defending herself. And as I go out to this park and see all these anti-Israel protesters and folks out there that, were waving BDS flags and you name it. Now, I was a U.S. service member. I'm very easily recognized as a U.S. service member. I usually have a ball cap on that says Army Rangers on it, and I don't have any legs. So people can put two and two together pretty quickly. And one night while I was out there, some of these protesters even harassed me for being a U.S. service member when they were actually out there to really harass Israel or those that are supporters of Israel. And that's when I really first made this jump in my mind for how quickly those that detest Israel and have this double standard for Israel protecting herself, how quickly they make that jump to attacking the United States of America or those that defended the U.S. as well. At that moment, myself, I was out there with my family when this occurred. And so when that happened, I went home that night, and I'm sitting with my wife, as we were for so many nights, watching the news and seeing what was going on. And I'm saying, listen, I don't know what it's going to look like yet, but I'm going to find a way, and I'm going to go and I'm going to show my support for Israel, because this is a ridiculous double standard that's going on where they're being attacked. They're defending themselves. If this occurred in the United States of America, guys like myself would go and we would kill every one of our enemies. And every American would be proud of us for doing so. And this double standard, it really upset me. So I, sought out the State Department and our consulates and other places and said, how can I go and find a way to serve, hopefully militarily? And they found this path, and I worked through SARL to go and serve and, hold no rank, but play a role in supporting their military over there in Israel in early 2015. And it's an experience that I never look back on. I learned an incredible amount about Israel and the culture and what I respect about why people fight or don't fight over there. And I'm sure we can get into all that if you want to, but I learned a tremendous amount over there just through that experience, being on base, being in uniform, being next to all of the service members of the IDF at that time.
Fascinating. Thank you, Congressman. We know you have also a great working relationship with our colleagues in the AJC Palm Beach office. And in that context, and what we also just heard from you, I'm excited to announce that you're extending this relationship that you also already have with our American colleagues across the pond, as you agreed to join our Transatlantic Friends of Israel. You are actually now the second Floridian next to your colleague Ted Deutsch, who has joined this growing network. So we are all very honored to have you on board, and thank you so much.
No, having these conversations and being able to have them from one government to another and discuss and be able to share our different perspectives and the way we're seeing things from our country and to yours. It's one of the most important conversations that we can try to foster.
Fantastic. Anna Michelle, let's discuss the trilateral relationship between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, which took only a little more than 2,000 years or so to finally become a reality.
Right.
Cypriot and Greek leaders have publicly acknowledged the role that AJC played in helping to bring about this alliance, which we always considered as fairly obvious. As a Greek member of the European Parliament, what's the significance of this trilateral relationship for you personally, for Greece, but perhaps also potentially for the rest of Europe?
Well, Daniel, AJC, as far as I'm concerned, and I got involved in politics maybe a little late in life, but AJC was always present. Israel was recognized by Greece. I don't need to talk about Greece and Cyprus. Greece and Cyprus have always been very close, but Israel was actually recognized by Greece in 1990 by the father of Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, when the Minister of Foreign Affairs was Antonis Samaras, who was Prime Minister from my party a few years ago. AJC has always been with us in the past 10 years that I've been around, pushing for this strategic relationship. I think that this alliance is I would call it a geostrategic alliance that guarantees or can guarantee three critical things: peace, stability, and prosperity. And I'm mentioning this, everybody knows the East Med project. This is a very important project from economically, it's a very important project politically, it's a very important project because it gives us an alternative route, an alternative autonomous supply of critical energy supply. I also, Turkey, I know we'll talk about Turkey, I hope, but Turkey is is a big threat, and this brings us all together to offer more stability in the region. So this strategic alliance is just very important for everybody, and I think it's very important for the United States as well. As you know, Greece and the United States are now in an excellent place. I mean, the President Trump calls our relationship at the moment amazing, which is true. We recently signed the protocol on the amendment to the Mutual Defense Cooperation Agreement. So that's led to closer ties, and we're very pleased also, of course, with the way that the United States is dealing with Turkey. So all of this is very important, I think, to everybody, and we try through AJC also in the transatlantic context and in the European Parliament to focus people on how important this relationship is, not just for Greece or Turkey or Greece or Cyprus or Israel, but for Europe as a whole.
Right. Maybe you mentioned that everybody knows the East Med pipeline project, but I assume not perhaps everybody on this call. So just very briefly as background for our listeners, there are, of course, tremendous natural gas finds off the coast of Israel and Cyprus, potentially also in Greece. And there is now a pipeline project to bring this gas via Greece to continental Europe. And this is, of course, a tremendous opportunity, not just for these three countries, but would also help reduce Europe's energy dependency, particularly on Russia. Which brings me to Congressman Mast. You know, this trilateral partnership is increasingly also a linchpin of US national security thinking in the region. In December, Congress passed the bipartisan Eastern Mediterranean Security and Energy Partnership Act, which AJC championed from its inception. And the aim is not only to provide security, economic, and energy cooperation between these three countries and the United States. There were also other elements like lifting the outdated arms embargo on Cyprus, providing additional funds for military assistance, both to Greece and Cyprus, but also the restrictions of the sale of the F-35 to Turkey because of its close relationship with Russia and its speculation of buying S-400 anti-missile radar systems. And of course, this Congressional Act also addressed the violations of Cyprus' exclusive economic zone, which happens quite a lot through Turkey and Greece's airspace. So particularly these measures were clearly directed at Ankara. So my question to you is, how are we going to manage the relationship with an important NATO partner, after all, like Turkey, but which appears to increasingly turn away from the West?
So I think we could talk about this on a couple of different fronts. One, let's just not gloss over the fact of how important that is to have that security cooperation with an energy provider in the Eastern Med. Not necessarily for everything that goes on here in the continental United States of America, but for where's the rest of Europe need to look for supply for you pick the item, and does it need to come from Russia and Vladimir Putin, or is there another option to bring that in from somewhere else? And what does that do to the entire security dynamic if you're taking dollars out from their picture, moving them to somebody that we're going to see as a stronger ally? Now, I think that's an important piece of that conversation. And when, in my opinion, when you show some of those NATO allies like Turkey that, listen, there are other places to go. Now Turkey is a strong ally, an incredible, military strength, no doubt. And we want to see that continue, but we have to let them know, listen, there has to be an honest look in the mirror. And that's what the US is going to look. Who's going to be the best partner? Who's going to say, these are the ideological alliances that we have here? Who are we going to look to? Or who's going to be the partner in terms of buying those defense procurements, or getting those defense procurements from the US? Or are you going to go and get something from Russia and get under another system? Or do we have to worry about the sharing of technology in different ways? And this is a place that there's a lot of question for the US right now. Obviously, that's been going on. You see this go on as it relates to what's gone on in Syria as well. There's been a number of dealings on both sides of it going on with Turkey, but this is where I really think it's a time to push back against Turkey and say, we have other allies that maybe you don't get along with quite as well, but they're still our ally. And we're going to go out there and show support for them, because they're proving to be somebody that shows that they want to have a relationship with the United States for the long term in the future. And you seem to be showing that you want to turn away from the US in these different fronts. So it's time for you to, as they say, go or get off the pot, or, hop off the fence, but you need to pick one side or the other. And I think that's the direction that the US is going right now, is saying, listen, you need to make this decision because it's not going to be open-ended indefinitely.
Right. Anna Michelle, from where you are sitting, do you think Turkey's getting the message? How worried are the Greek government and the security services about these violations of Greek airspace and the Cypriot exclusive economic zone?
Well, we're kind of used to it. Let's put it that way, because this is nothing new, especially when Erdogan has internal problems, and he has a lot of problems right now. He tends to export them internationally and export the tension. So we're used to the airspace violations, and we're used to the talk. I have to agree with the congressman that this is a time to make hard choices, and hard choices have to do with alliances, whether we're talking about east, west, whether we're talking about Turkey or China. You have to make choices. Regardless of which way you go, it's a no-brainer that you have to comply with international law from our perspective, and that's something that Turkey just hasn't been doing. I mean, when you talk about what they did signing this Libyan MOU, and I'll explain it this time, Daniel, this is a memorandum of understanding that Turkey signed with Libya, and they ignore geographically that they pretend to border. So they sort of ignore that if you look at a map, that Greece is right in the Greek islands are right in the middle. And this clearly violates international law, as was recognized by Israel. Thank you very much. Immediately. And we've complained about this to the United Nations. Also, Turkey supposedly wants to join the European Union. Well, this is, one of the basics of being in the European family is you actually do respect international law. And thirdly, Turkey uses this immigration problem, uses migrants as to blackmail Greece. They did this whole thing on our border, and luckily our prime minister actually brought the Europeans to actually show them what was going on, and to realize that this blackmail is not addressed towards just Greece, it's addressed towards Europe. And so when you pick a side, and when the US or when anybody else thinks of picking sides, when you pick Greece, you actually get Europe too. So
right. That's important.
Kind of helpful.
Right. Congressman Mast, since we are discussing global hotspots, we can't avoid discussing China. Tension between the US and China rising. You serve on the subcommittee for Asia, the Pacific and Non-Proliferation, and in the Congressional Executive Commission on China. Where do you think this critical relationship is heading, and to what extent can you talk about whether there is a lot of bipartisan consensus or rather disagreement on this issue?
I've been on a number of calls, even just prior to me getting on this video conference right now, discussing China. I don't think there's a question bipartisanly in the House of Representatives, at least, that the relationship with China is chilling. It is cooling. Now, when I use that term cooling or getting cold, I think it's important to identify the difference between what we recognize as what was cold with the former Soviet Socialist Republic and the difference between what is cold with China. Because when we were going through that for decades with Russia, right? Russia was a global military. China certainly has that capability to be a global military, but they're not totally leveraging that yet. That's not the in-your-face kind of military that we faced with the USSR. Russia at that time had very little interest in trade with the West, whereas we have a very important relationship with one another right now, China and the United States of America, obviously in terms of trade. Now, this brings into play one of the places where we can be most effective in exercising something I've heard some people say, which is ABC, anywhere but China. You know, when it comes to manufacturing right now, especially when we're talking about strategic goods, right? They want to make rubber dog toys. We don't necessarily care, but some of these items that we rely on for defense, for health, for other things, there's going to be a substantial cooling of that relationship where you can't say we're going to look to the, you know, one of the biggest aggressors and potential foes that we face as also the chief place that we look to for manufacturing for the United States of America. That would make no sense for the U.S. at all. So there is going to be a natural cooling that occurs there. I think, you know, obviously there's a lot at play when you talk about the relationship between the US dollar and Chinese currency. When you look at what's going on with China, not venturing necessarily, as I said, militarily to everybody's shores, but doing something that the United States used to do a very good job of, and that was going into other countries that need assistance and saying, listen, you give us, you know, this many votes in the UN or here, this kind of thing, support our policy here, and we're willing to help you out on this front with electrical grids or roads or things like that. We see US or China coming all the way into, you know, US territory, places like the Bahamas, and obviously down into South and Central America, where they're threatening the US in those places. So there's a lot for us to pay attention to on these fronts that adds to the chilling of that relationship when we see them entering into our backyard with a physical presence in that kind of way. But yeah, those are my opinions on what I see going on and how I think you see the US reacting, not just saying this is what we determined as nefarious as it relates to COVID and as it relates to theft of intellectual property or as it relates to monetary policy, but this is what we really see as the future because of the way that you are threatening the US. And I think the US is going to be a leader in asking others to pull away from China in this way that only the US can lead.
Right. Thank you. Anna Michelle, you are also the vice chair of the European Parliament's International Trade Committee. So, you know, this is right up your alley. What are your thoughts on this, you know, on the future of this critical relationship, and can you give us, you know, a little bit the state of the debate in the wider EU? I know it's complicated, 27 member states, but is there something like a consensus emerging in Europe?
Well, I have to be honest, for me, it's not that complicated. I mean, the premise on which building this relationship with China was based was that, you know, if we integrate them into the Western system, then they'll start looking more like a Western country. I mean, they have a different political system, they have different values, they have different practices, but we figured that if we work closely with them and let them in, then they'll start becoming like us. And quite frankly, that's just not happening. And I think that we have to, at some point, bravely look in the mirror and say, okay, we've made a mistake. This premise is just not holding true. Now, what's happening in Parliament is, in my committee, is we're shifting the discussion very much toward something which Congressman Mast just said, which is the notion of strategic autonomy for Europe. If COVID-19 has showed something, is that, you know, these supply chains are now so they're integrated, and we're so dependent on China for so many things that we actually have to start thinking about reshoring industry. At least this is what we're discussing in Europe, and which industries are strategic and which supplies are strategic in order to diversify supply chains so that we're not dependent on China or on anybody else for that matter. I mean, clearly we can't do it all ourselves. I think that globalization is now at a point where there is no return, but there is a return to diversification of supply chains. And I think with new technologies like 3D printing, labor costs are going to take a different, there's going to be a different notion of labor costs as well. So we can do reshoring. When we talk about trade, as you know very well, Daniel, we talk about in Europe, we want a multilateral rules-based system, but trade is also based on values. And I think that the United States, and this is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about investing in the transatlantic relationship when it comes to trade, and even though things have been very tense and difficult over the past years, I think that now, especially because of what we've seen in the COVID-19 virus with respect to our dependency on China, it's normal that we should, those of us that have similar values should come together to deal with these threats. And that, I think, for me, is sort of the compass going forward in the way Europe needs to look at China and at the transatlantic relationship. But like you said, not everybody shares my passion, either at in the members of the European Parliament or in the member states. Many member states have investments, Chinese investments, and a lot of them are discovering that they're not what they expected them to be, even in terms of how much money they're actually leaving behind in the country. And this is a wake-up call for a lot of member states and for a lot of my colleagues.
Okay, thank you, Anna Michelle. I think we've reached a point where we should hand it over back to Daniel and take some questions from the audience. Daniel?
Thank you, Daniel. And as a reminder, if you'd like to send in a question, you can email questions@ajc.org. That's questions plural. So our first question says, hi, Anna Michelle, it's David Harris. What's your assessment as a new member of the European Parliament's approach to Israel? What more can be done to deepen understanding of Israel and its importance to Europe in the Parliament and elsewhere in the EU structure? And to you, Congressman Mast, also from AJC CEO David Harris. Thank you very much for your valiant service to our country. What's your current assessment of bipartisan support for Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship in the House of Representatives? Historically, bipartisan support, of course, has been essential to the link and to us at AJC. So, Anna Michelle?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, David. I think that if I would just use one word to say what we need to do in the Parliament is we need to have a very strong voice. We need to be constantly vocal in raising the issues, like what happened now, Daniel, the letter that we wrote now to Borrell about the incredible statements that were made by the EU ambassador about allowing members who are affiliated with terrorist organizations, saying that it doesn't matter if they work for NGOs, and allowing EU funds to go to NGOs that actually have members who are affiliated with terrorist organizations. We can't let that just go by. I mean, we need to write a letter, we need to ask a question, we need to table questions, we need to ask for a resolution. So I think what we need to do is just have a very strong voice. We need to continue to ask for the European Parliament to do what they should to recognize that there is no, there are no two Hezbollahs. There's only one, for Christ's sake. And I mean, just go ahead and do what the rest of the world has done. So that's what we need to do, I think, be more vocal. And you as AJC, I say, aside from helping us by giving us facts, by giving us arguments, by giving us access to other people who understand these issues and deepening our understanding, taking colleagues over to Israel to see this with their own eyes, there is no substitute for that.
Thank you, Congressman Mast. Yeah,
listen, I think in the House of Representatives, we're probably in one of the most tumultuous times for a bipartisan support for Israel. within the House. There's unprecedented actions and divide that are going on within certainly one of my committees, the Foreign Affairs Committee. Proposals that are being put out there from our two-party system here, the top of the ticket on the other side of the aisle from me, folks saying, let's talk about another group here, right? Because this was just recently in the news. Aipac, folks saying that we're presidential candidates. No, I wouldn't go to an Aipac conference to talk about Israel. You would have never heard that before. That was a staggering thing to have folks saying within the House of Representatives and even on the Foreign Affairs Committee that they support the BDS movement, that they want to see that continue, that they want to see, as we talk about looking in the mirror and saying who's the friend and who is the enemy, that we're going to use U.S. support as leverage to say, not just are you our friend or our ally, but let's also try to control, those that you have conflict over there in the Eastern Med, namely what's going on with the Israel-Palestinian conflict there. And these are unprecedented actions that I think go entirely in the wrong direction, but these are very real conversations that are going on right now in the House of Representatives. And as I said, all the way up to the top of our ticket, those that want to run for the presidency as well. And that's, I think, a truly sad moment for the state of relations and support from the United States of America for our great friend and ally Israel. That, as we talked about in the beginning, I was very proud to be able to say, I've served alongside both the defenders of the United States of America and the defenders of Israel.
Daniel, before we get back, let me just add my comments, my experiences, of course, in Europe. So I'll speak only about the situation there, and I can only underline what both of you have said, but that it's really important to speak up. This is what is absolutely fundamental. And in my experience, again, in Europe, I think the Friends of Israel, certainly in the parliaments, are actually much more numerous. But the problem is the speaking up. Not everybody who is a friend has the time, maybe, or thinks he has the time or she has the time, or sometimes really the courage to speak up, because the other side is very radical, it's very vocal. But we are seeing more and more people like you, Anna Michelle, and that's absolutely critical to take a stand and to call out the other side. And with that, I'm quite optimistic. Back to you, Danielle.
Ms. Asimakopoulou, many of our viewers, including BOG member Merle Horowitz, are concerned with European funding for Palestinian entities, particularly as pay-to-slay practices continue. What more can the EU do to make sure that EU funds are not going toward rewarding terrorism?
Well, they can just stop. I mean, that would just be the easiest thing. But I mean, I think you have to talk about procedures and mostly transparency. I mean, knowing where the money, follow the money, and knowing where it's going, and having a roster, seeing who's who, and not allowing for these loopholes, these giant loopholes of, okay, we have a list of NGOs, for example, but if you're not, if your name isn't on the list and you're in the NGO, you get money anyway. That's ridiculous. So mostly it's about transparency. I think we've won the battle that you can't give money to terrorists. That's kind of that's a battle that's won. Now I think we're talking about the procedures to safeguard that the money is not going where it's not supposed to. And that's not, I'm not saying that that's easy, but that's where we need to focus.
I wish we'd already won that battle here.
Our next question comes from Blake in St. Louis. I'm so glad to see lawmakers from both sides of the Atlantic in one conversation. From your perspective, and we'll begin with you, Congressman Mast, what is the biggest challenge that the United States and Europe need to tackle together, and what more can be done?
I think we've had a pretty in-depth conversation about that in terms of the relationships that exist with China and what's going to happen in terms of broad-based treaties between China or Russia or Iran or others throughout the entire region. what happens with their relationship and their coming together? How does that change the global landscape? What does that change militarily? What does that change through trade? What does that change through every form of policy that we have? One of the biggest things that we deal with domestically here that puts every bit of our policy underneath the shadow is what goes on with U.S. debt and spending here. That puts our foreign policy, our monetary policy, our fiscal policy, social welfare policy, you name it, every policy that we have here falls underneath that shadow, where we can't necessarily accomplish them in the way that we could were we not $20+ trillion in debt. And that's one of the big things that I think allows some of these actors to be more malign than what they otherwise would be.
Anna Michelle, would you like to address that question as well?
I really, I mean, Congressman and I see eye to eye on that. I have nothing constructive to add. Let's put it that way. It's just, you've paired me with a good speaker. We really see things in the same way.
All right, our next question comes from, we've actually been getting several questions about this, but it comes from Stacy in Miami. From both Congress's perspectives and the EU's perspective, Iran is a country to watch. Ms. Asimakopoulou, can you discuss the EU's current thinking on Iran? And Congressman Mast, perhaps you can discuss Congress's thoughts as well. How concerned should we be about Iran this time, be it his nefarious activities or its nuclear program?
Should I start?
Sure.
Yes. Well, I think that, again, I'll start with my personal perspective. Europe is not as hardcore as it should be about the issue with Iran. There are a lot of people in the European Parliament who, call a spade, but not everybody does. Should we be worried? Yeah, of course we should be worried. What should we do? We should be more vigilant and again, I mean, in terms of Parliament, I guess mostly more vocal about and forthcoming about what's going on. But the European Union doesn't have a very, let's say, clear line on where it's going with that. Borrell doesn't, and I don't think AFIT does either. That's our Committee on Foreign Affairs, unfortunately.
Congressman?
Yeah, look, could go to a number of fronts on here. We'll start one place that, again, I hate seeing this divide within our own House of Representatives, but you saw when General Soleimani was taking out a terrorist, a leader of terrorists, was taken off of the battle space in a way that I appreciated greatly. There was divide here in the U.S. saying, not was this a wise action? Was this one of the best things that we could have done for global security from this actor? But, this argument about was it the right timing or why did we do it now? Or instead of answering the most important question on the table and how did this really advance the globe? And I think this really requires, again, I've used this term probably 3 times already. We got to look in the mirror and we got to have the hard conversation about scratching the surface of what policy does, right? So if we say, well, what about if we do allow Iran to have more dollars when they're really acting as a colonizer throughout the Middle East, trying to take their tentacle of Hezbollah, put any government that they can underneath their control? What does it do if we allow them increased access into the global economy if they have essentially colonized various states throughout the Middle East? Or if we want to go back and have the conversation about ballistic missile development or establishing a foothold in terms of nuclear technology, let's step back and recognize that we're talking about technologies that were developed in the 1940s and 50s. And what has prevented states, bad actor states like Iran, from reaching the same level of technology in those weapon systems that we mastered in or developed in the 40s, mastered the delivery systems, those triads throughout the 50s, 60s, and then you had a number of other states such as China and in India, and you name it, master it through those years. How did they not do that when this is technology from the 1940s? Well, we did it by not allowing them access to the materials and not allowing them the access to the technology, not allowing them access to the testing systems, and a number of other things. We need to foster those programs. If you look at Iran and say, yes, I believe that Iran wants to threaten these other states, I believe that we should take them seriously. So I believe we should continue to do everything that we did throughout all of those decades to prevent them from getting this capability in weapons systems, as an example. I think, again, it just involves those very important but hard conversations where you have to take hard lines. And if you don't do that and you don't scratch the surface of what allowing them one little step into the financial world does, or allowing them one little step in terms of procurement of fissile materials or other things do, then you put yourself in a much worse situation where you have to talk about what goes on if you have to go into Tehran in 15 years from now. What does Iran look like?
Right. Daniel, if I may step in here for a second for a follow-up question for the Congressman. The United Nations Security Council resolution that implemented the nuclear deal, unfortunately, turned an open-ended weapons embargo against Iran into one that comes now with a deadline, which is running out very soon. And luckily, at least on this front, there seems to be bipartisan agreement that the US administration ought to do everything in order to prevent that. I think it's in October, Iran could in theory start buying advanced weapons from probably Russia or China. How do you think this will play out, whether that bipartisan support would remain, even if the US were to invoke what is called the snapback option, basically at the UN, bringing back all United Nations sanctions in order to prevent Iran from having the weapons embargo lifted? Do you think that that consensus would remain?
So one, you have that certainly one of the strongest possible advocates, probably the strongest administration in terms of fighting back against Iran here in the U.S. as we speak. The Trump administration couldn't be stronger on this front. Now, I think what you see going forward is not just the conversation in terms of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and what's gone on there, but going back to what I was speaking about in the previous comments with some of these other weapons of defense, right? I like to put things in historical perspective. And so I'm going to step back and say Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Why was there this hours deadline on the Cuban Missile Crisis? What historically created that? Well, what created that wasn't the fact that you could get a missile system or an attack system up and running that had a nuclear capability. It was, how much time was it going to take to get their defensive capabilities up and running that would make it much more difficult to go out there and eliminate any nuclear capabilities that they had on the ground at the time? And I think this is that same kind of conversation right now. What does allowing them this access to buying other Russian weapons systems from surface to air, air to air, from something that comes out of the belly of an aircraft, something, if they're going to develop their triad system and be able to fire, something closer to anybody's shores off of a submarine, that means that number one, they have to have their ability to purchase those systems opened up, which is what we're talking about right now. And everybody should really scratch their head and say, is that something I really want to allow Iran to have access to? Is that level of defense that makes a totally different game for going out there and being able to eliminate their ability to have, let's say, a nuclear weapons system or anything else that we face. So I think that's really where that becomes the most important part of the conversation. The same way that, like I said, you look historically back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why was there that timeline on it? Because they were going to be able to defend themselves in a lot different way once those defensive systems became up and running.
All right. Thank you, Congressman. Daniel, back to you.
Sure. I have final questions here. Ms. Asimakopoulou, for you first. Many years ago, Greece was considered a foe or certainly opposed to many of Israel's policies. How did this change come about, such that Greece is now one of Israel's strongest proponents today? And then, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I'll have time to think.
Sure. Then Congressman Mast, for you, and this is from Hanson in Connecticut, there are elements of the modern Republican Party that are more isolationist. What do you say to people in your own party who are suspicious of institutions like NATO and other multilateral bodies? So Anna Michelle, you first.
I think that Greece just got politicians who were at some point a lot braver about talking openly about Israel. I don't think that it's really fair to say that Greece was a foe. I think it's more fair to say that Greece found politicians who made it brave enough to become a friend openly. And once we started cultivating this relationship, I think it became more, and building this relationship, I think it became more and more apparent that this was not just, this was and can be and will be a strategic alliance. And like I said, I think even in the recent history where I've been involved in politics, there's a growing awareness in my administration that Israel is inspiring in many respects. I'll just tell you, and Israel has helped us very much during the years of the economic crisis, and with our military, with our counterterrorism activities, but also has helped us put together a plan to digitize our economy, and taught us a lot about the innovation culture and the spirit. In the previous government, Israel actually wrote the plan that our government is now using and is now stepping on to up innovation and to do all this digital work that we're doing now in the States. So let's say we started off slowly in the public eye, but at the moment, the relationship between Israel and Greece is at a very, very, very good point. And this is well known in the public and a bipartisan thing, just so you know.
Thank you. Congressman?
Yeah, so I think when you use the term isolation, I look at isolation as an ideological direction for a nation. And I don't think that's what the United States of America wants at all, is isolation. It's, again, this hard look to say, listen, your yes is going to be yes and your no is going to be no. But we're not going to let you ride the fence. We're not going to have a situation where there's a country in Europe that says, listen, we want the US to put all of these resources into defense, into joint training, into all of these things to defend against Russia, but at the same time, we're going to procure all of these things from Russia. That's not a just relationship. So pushing back against that, it's not a desire for isolation. It's a desire to say, we want to see the right thing happen in terms of these treaties that you've already agreed to and what you're asking of the U.S. service member, of the U.S. Treasury, of the U.S. taxpayer. And we could look at this on a host of different places. It's not a desire for isolation for the sake of isolation. It's that there has been an allowance to push the boundaries of these treaties and these relationships that do not, in my opinion, in many cases, respect the U.S. taxpayer and what has been their commitment, or the U.S. service member and what has been their commitment to defense. And so I think that's where you see, in my opinion, probably this divide. We want to have these friends. We want to have these allies. We want to have these coalitions if we have to go out there and defend somewhere. But it's got to be somebody that we can truly rely on. As I said, their yes be yes and their no be no. I'll put it in another way, just real quickly. Somebody once said that, to not have anybody around you is not necessarily lonely. What's the most lonely situation is to have the wrong people surrounding you. And I think that's a little bit of the way that we're looking at this. You have to have the right people surrounding you with the right commitments. It's not a desire to be standing alone. It's a desire to have the right backers.
All right, Congressman, Anna Michelle, thank you both so much for joining us today and your continued partnership with AJC. And I would like to thank our audience from around the world for tuning in. Don't miss our upcoming programs, which you can find on our website, ajc.org. And with that, back to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you both for that fascinating discussion. And thanks to our partners at Jewish Insider. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the Transatlantic Alliance. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter most. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one, and so we can continue standing up for the Jewish people, for Israel, and for the values that unite us all. Visit ajc.org/donate. Our next Advocacy Anywhere program will be tomorrow, May 12th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. Joining us will be Batya Ungar-Sargon, opinion editor at The Forward, and Seth Mandel, executive editor at Washington Examiner magazine, discussing identity politics, polarization, and the collapse of the center, the changing political landscape in the United States. We hope you will join us. Please stay safe and healthy, everyone.